Today, we're jumping into a really specific and honestly fascinating set of ancient rules, the ones laid out for the Levitical priesthood. And these weren't just, helpful tips. They were sacred ordinances that shaped every single part of a priest's life. So what we're going to do here is try to figure out the logic behind it all. Let's get right into it.
To really get this, we've got to ask a pretty big question first. What does it actually mean to be holy? I think we tend to hear that word and just think morally good. But in the world of this ancient text, the definition is way more specific. And it's basically the key that unlocks this entire system.
And there it is, holiness. In this context means to be set apart. It's all about creating a separation, a clear line between what's sacred and what's common, between the divine and just everyday life. Every single rule we're about to look at, it's all designed to build and protect that separation.
All right, first up, let's talk about the big picture. For these priests, holiness wasn't something you just did on the weekends. Nope, it was a 24/7, all-in kind of commitment, a holy calling that defined their entire existence. And that word profane, that's the one to really zero in on here. It just means treating something sacred like it's no big deal, making it common. So the stakes were incredibly high. Their behavior was directly tied to the honor of the God they served. This is pretty much the foundational command for everything else.
So how did this whole being set apart idea actually work in practice? Well, one of the biggest, most important boundaries a priest had to guard was the one between life and death. The idea was, as servants of a living God, their world was the world of the living. Contact with death was a major source of ritual impurity.
But, the rule wasn't totally rigid. The text actually lays out some very specific and, you could say, compassionate exceptions. A priest was allowed to have contact with the body of a very close family member, a parent, a child, a brother, or an unmarried sister who depended on him. So you can see the structured allowance for grief, even inside a really strict system.
But then you look at the high priest, and wow, the standard just skyrockets. For him, the guy who was the absolute peak of holiness, there were 0 exceptions. He couldn't become unclean even for his own mom or dad. His job required this unbroken state of ritual purity, no matter what.
So you have to ask, what's the logic behind a rule that intense? Well, the text itself gives us the why, right here. This holy status wasn't something the priest earned on his own, it was given by the divine. It's basically a statement of divine ownership. The point is that the rules aren't just random, they're supposed to be a direct reflection of God.
Now this whole set-apart thing, it didn't just stop with their job description. Oh no, it extended right down to the priest's own physical body, and even his family. They were, in a way, walking, talking symbols of holiness. You can see this perfectly in the rules about how a priest could look. The rules against shaving their heads, trimming the sides of their beards, or cutting their bodies, these weren't just style tips. These were things that people in other cultures often did to mourn their dead. So by saying, don't do this, the text was basically branding the priests, marking them as totally different and dedicated only to their God. And you see the exact same pattern with marriage. A regular priest already had rules about who he could marry to keep his household pure. But look, once again, for the high priest, the bar is raised even higher. He had to marry a virgin from his own people, making sure the priestly family line itself stayed set apart. Okay, now this is probably one of the most jarring rules in the entire text. The punishment is incredibly severe, and the reason given ties right back to our main theme. Her actions, according to this text, weren't just a personal mistake. They were seen as something that directly dirtied her father's sacred status, disgracing the very priesthood he stood for.
Okay, so all of this leads us to what might be the toughest part of the text to wrestle with. It's a section all about physical wholeness, and it frames this as a requirement for anyone who is going to approach the altar, which was seen as a symbol of divine perfection.
So here's the main rule, and I want you to notice the really specific wording here. The restriction is about the job, to come near to offer the food of his God. That is a hugely important distinction to make before we even look at the list of what the text calls a defect. And this is so important to understand. The text draws a bright line between someone's value as a person and their role in a ritual. A priest descendant with a physical defect, they were still family. They still got to eat the holy food. They weren't kicked out. The rule was only about who could perform the sacred duties right up at the altar. And this slide just gives you a sense of the kinds of things the text lists as prohibited defects.
They cover a whole range of conditions, from things people were born with to injuries they might have gotten later. The core idea was that the person who stood at the altar, representing the divine, had to be a physical symbol of wholeness and perfection.
So we've looked at all these detailed rules about death, marriage, the physical body. Let's pull it all back and ask, what's the big idea here? What does holiness really mean in this entire system?
Well, it all boils down to this logic of separation, right? First, the priest was basically a living, walking symbol of wholeness. Second, all these super strict rules created a really clear line. You were either on the holy side or the ordinary side, no confusion. And third, the whole point was to keep them in a constant state of ritual readiness, prepared to serve at any moment.
And that brings us right back to where we started, with the text's ultimate reason for everything. This whole complex system isn't presented as some human invention. It's framed as a divine institution. The power behind the holiness and the authority for the rules that protect it is presented as coming directly from God.
And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. When a society connects spiritual roles so tightly with the physical body, what does that tell you about how they understood the world? How they saw the link between the body and the spirit, the material and the divine? It's a really incredible peek into a completely different way of seeing things.